Hi, this is Dan Hickey, coming to you again from my office in the Wright School of Education at Indiana University. This is the fifth in a short series of videos concerning the practices, principles, and policies of educational assessment. In this assessment practices video, I'll discuss portfolio assessment. This is really one of my very favorite assessment topics. While I focus a lot on performance assessments in my research, in recent years I've really focused a lot of my attention on portfolio assessment, particularly in my own teaching, but also in some of the teachers I'm collaborating with. In both my face-to-face doctoral seminars and in my online classes, I use what I call wikifolios. These are public, shared documents that all of the students in the class can see and comment upon. They're kind of like e-portfolios that are getting really popular in class now. I'm going to talk about both wikifolios and portfolio assessment some in this class, but also talk a little bit about e-portfolios that some of you may be considering. What is portfolio assessment? It's really a systematic collection of one's work in a way that displays one's skills and accomplishment over time. It's typically updated as individual skills and accomplishments grow. It's usually regarded as a collaborative approach to assessment with a lot of interaction between instructors and students, and ideally between students and peers. And it should generally involve student self-assessment. Let's talk about the benefits and drawbacks of portfolio assessment. First, portfolio assessment strengthens the relationship between instruction and assessment because the number of samples that are collected in the portfolio, and because of the intention that the work will be regularly evaluated and updated, and that the assessment of that work will drive future instruction and student learning. Second, the portfolio is tailored to individual students' growth, so there's more attention being placed on what the individual is learning. These benefits also lead to some of the major drawbacks in portfolio assessment. First, it's really time-consuming. You'll see on the next slide that classroom portfolio assessment involves regular individual meetings with the students or a lot of interaction with the teacher. This can take up a lot of class time, so you really need to know what you're doing when you do portfolio assessments. Second, it's difficult to compare students to one another. You're so focused on individual growth and personalization that you really don't know if you need to compare students in a summative sense with each other. It's very difficult to do with portfolio assessment. This also causes issues in scoring and is the source of much of the unreliability. The large-scale portfolio assessment projects in the U.S. in 1990s failed miserably because of these issues. This was unfortunate because it convinced many teachers that portfolios are too unreliable for classroom use, and that's just not the case. For these reasons, I don't generally evaluate the contents of student portfolios in my classes. Rather, I have students reflect on their engagement, and then I evaluate those reflections for evidence of coherence and engagement in the activities that I know will lead towards the curricular aim. I then use conventional assessments to evaluate the effectiveness of my instruction, to motivate the students to focus on the curricular aim, and to make sure that they are indeed mastering the underlying concepts behind the portfolio. If you go on the web, you'll find lots of guidelines for good portfolio assessments. These are the 7 ingredients that Jim Popham outlines in his textbook. First, explain to the students that they will own their portfolio and expect them to be heavily involved in the portfolio assessment process. I really go crazy with this one, and that I really push students to personalize their portfolios. I had them reiterate their own relevant experiences, interests, and aspirations. In my assessment class, I have students define a curricular aim that embodies their context. Many portfolios don't do this, and it ends up feeling a lot more like a collection of assignments. You really want to try to avoid that. Second, you want to predetermine what kinds of work samples will end up in the portfolio. In my case, I'm really quite specific about what I want students to produce in their wikifolios. One piece of advice I have is to try to be consistent. One of the mistakes people make in portfolio assessment is having students undertake a whole bunch of different sort of activities, and they have to learn a bunch of stuff each time about how to do the portfolio or the e-portfolio that really doesn't relate at all to the curricular aim. You want to try to avoid that. In my classes, I have the students complete the same routine over and over, but I change the content of that routine each week. That can save you a lot of time. Again, you really don't want students learning a bunch of stuff so that they can demonstrate their knowledge. The fourth ingredient in successful portfolios is evaluation criteria. As with performance assessments, you want to clearly communicate the criteria to your students. You might select the criteria collaboratively with the students, further increasing their ownership in the portfolio. As I mentioned earlier, I don't like to grade the actual content of the portfolio, but even if you use a skill-focused rubrics, students will want to argue about points. They'll also demand a lot of individualized feedback, as in, is this what you want? Did I do it right? Did I get it right? You want to try to avoid that, and that'll often happen if you really summatively evaluate portfolio assessments. Students who take my 4-credit classes know that all they have to do is complete their Wikifolio on time, post it by the deadline, and write a coherent reflection. If the reflection's coherent and the assignment's complete, I just give them the full points. I spend almost no time grading. That saves a lot of time so that I'm able to interact with those students in a more formative way. Our 5th ingredient in effective portfolio assessment is student self-assessment. Now, this is easier said than done. Most students don't like to evaluate other students' work, and most students don't like to have their work evaluated, particularly in a formal, summative sense. For the past few years, I've been experimenting with something that is working out really well for me. I call it peer endorsement and peer promotion. My weekly assignments instruct students to endorse the work of some number of their peers as being complete. Not good, not bad, but simply complete. Did they complete the task? It really gets students interacting, and it accomplishes a sense of informal accountability. It helps me know that they're done, and it encourages students to finish on time. Then I also have students endorse one and only one of their peers' work each week as being exemplary. I found that this creates some friendly and productive competition among students because they really want to get those promotions from their classmates, so they really work hard to do a good job on the assignments. Some people argue that this form of competition is problematic, but I fundamentally disagree. I think as long as you can see that the competition is leading students to engage and doesn't create cheating and doesn't create problems like that, I think it's fine. It's worth giving a try at least. But again, you want to make sure, look at the interaction, look at the discourse that's fostered by any competition to find out whether those sorts of things are helping or hurting. The 6th ingredient in portfolio assessment, according to Popham, is what he calls portfolio conferences. Particularly with younger learners, these can be really great. They can help create what some people call a portfolio culture. This is meant to show student growth, and it really accomplishes what Popham calls purposeful portfolios. But be careful in trying to accomplish too many goals with your portfolios. In particular, you want to keep in mind that it's really hard to make summative claims about what students really know and are capable of in the future based on portfolio assessment. In other words, portfolios have more formative function than summative function. Finally, Popham suggests involving parents. This is one of the reasons that e-portfolios should be very appealing even with younger learners. Especially if there's a place for peers, instructors, and parents to leave comments on student work, e-portfolios can be really exciting. Let's discuss appraising portfolios. Generally speaking, you want to use a skill-focused rubric. You don't want to use a task-focused rubric because that's really going to focus too much on specific features. You also don't want a hyper-general rubric that doesn't really give enough detail. Let's review the 5 guidelines for constructing a skill-focused rubric. First, all of the skills that are assessed should be significant to student learning. Second, all of those skills should be criteria that can be addressed instructionally. With those guidelines in mind, you should use as few evaluative criteria as possible so that your instructor and the student and your instruction don't get overwhelmed with details. With that in mind, you should create distinct labels for each criteria so that you have a shared vocabulary with which to discuss the criteria with your students. Finally, be sure to keep your preferences in mind and take into account the stakes attached to the portfolio. Don't be overly detailed. Keep your own preferences in mind. In particular, think about the level of detail that suits you. I've refined them extensively over the years to find ways that get students to interact with each other and to interact with the disciplinary knowledge of assessment. You want to avoid errors in scoring student portfolios, but if the stakes are high, you really want to be careful. The first type of error comes from flaws in the scoring instrument, such as the rubric. Carefully construct your rubrics and avoid these kinds of mistakes. The second type of error are called procedural flaws. These occur when unclear instructions for tasks are given, too many criteria are being scored at one time, or too many test takers are scored at one time. Avoid this by thinking things through when constructing your portfolios and your rubrics. And as with performance assessment, personal bias error may occur with portfolio assessment. You might be overly generous to all students, or you might be overly severe to all students. There might also be central tendency error where everybody's clustered in the middle. And then finally, your scoring might demonstrate the so-called halo effect, where some students are scored overly generously, whereas other students are scored harshly. That's all for now about creating effective portfolio assessments. I hope you'll give portfolio assessments serious consideration in your own classrooms, schools, and research. But I want to remind you, you really want to stay focused on the curricular aims. You want to watch what's happening around it. What are students engaging in? And are they engaging in what researchers call productive disciplinary engagement? In other words, are they making sense of the underlying ideas? You don't want them focusing too much on the specific tasks that go into the portfolio assessment. You want them to be reflecting and thinking about the bigger ideas behind that task. Finally, I want to make the suggestion that you consider doing what I do in my classes, which is bracketing portfolio assessment with more conventional selected response and constructed response items. I do the summative assessment with those, and I allow the portfolios to do the more formative assessment that they're really good at. That's all for now. Hope to see you again. Thanks. This is Dan Hickey.